3 days ago, inside the quiet marble halls of Zimbabwe's State House in Harare, something happened that almost no one in the Western world heard about. No breaking news alerts, no loud headlines. But for millions of people across southern Africa, this moment may eventually matter more than any election, any speech, or any summit. It was the kind of event that begins softly. No applause, no ceremony yet, carries the weight to reshape an entire region's future. Africa's richest man walked back into a country he abandoned 10 years ago. A man who once looked at Zimbabwe's chaos and said it wasn't worth the risk. And yet this time he signed his name on a billion-dollar deal that could redraw the energy map of southern Africa. A 2,000-kilometer pipeline in a landlocked nation that most analysts had long written off as too fragile, too unstable, too broken to ever rise again. But if you've lived long enough, you know that history moves in surprising ways. Sometimes quietly, sometimes in moments the rest of the world ignores, and sometimes through the decisions of one person whose vision doesn't match the fears of everyone else around him. Before this deal, Zimbabwe was a country running on empty, literally. Power cuts lasting 18 hours a day. Factories shutting down mid-shift. Hospitals burning through diesel like water just to keep patients alive. Dreams collapsing not because people lacked talent or ambition, but simply because the lights would not stay on. And then, suddenly, a different possibility appeared. A possibility that challenges the way Africa has been treated for decades, dependent on foreign contractors, foreign loans, foreign conditions. What happened in Harare this week forces us to ask, what if Africa is beginning to solve its own problems at its own prices? And what does that mean for everyone else, watching from the outside? Today, we're going to slow down. We're going to look beyond the headlines you were never shown. We'll unpack why one billionaire returned after a decade, why the world's most powerful energy players are paying attention, and why this quiet signing ceremony might mark the beginning of an entirely new chapter for southern Africa. This is the story behind the 2,000-kilometer pipeline, and the larger shift nobody is ready to talk about. To understand why this new deal matters, we first need to step back and look honestly at what Zimbabwe has been living through. For many Americans, power cuts are an inconvenience. A storm knocks out the grid for a night, and by morning, crews are working on repairs. But in Zimbabwe, blackouts became a way of life. 18 hours without electricity wasn't the exception. It was the daily rhythm of the nation. Imagine running a store, a bakery, or a small factory, and not knowing whether you'd have even a few hours of power that day. Imagine your refrigerator shutting off your machines, freezing mid-shift, your workers waiting in the dark, wondering whether to stay or go home. Hospitals already stretched thin were burning through diesel generators not because of natural disasters, but because the main power source of the entire country had dropped to just 9% of its normal capacity. Not 9% for a week, but for far too long. The World Bank estimated that Zimbabwe lost 6.1% of its GDP every year to these blackouts. That number isn't theoretical. Its factories closed, its layoffs, its entire communities slipping deeper into poverty, its opportunity dying quietly before it ever has a chance to grow. And then there's the geography, something most people around the world forget. Zimbabwe is landlocked. Every drop of fuel has to travel through other nations, hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers, across borders, ports, checkpoints, and political uncertainties. Every delay raises costs. Every disruption pushes the price higher. For a struggling economy, that burden is exhausting. So when you combine fragile power supplies, collapsing infrastructure, and a geography that forces dependence, you end up with a nation stuck in place. Not because of lack of effort, not because of lack of talent, but because the entire system is working against the people trying to build a future within it. For years, the answer was simple: almost no one. Most investors saw the power crisis, the landlocked geography, the bureaucratic hurdles, and they walked away before their plane even touched the ground. The memory of earlier years, especially the era of former President Robert Mugabe, left a long shadow. High-ranking officials had been known to demand mediation fees or unofficial payments just to move paperwork forward. Deals stalled, not because they lacked merit, but because they were tangled in layers of political risk. No serious investor wanted to fight those battles. And one of the people who walked away was Aliko Dangote. 10 years ago, Dangote arrived with big plans: cement, fertilizer, energy, a billion-dollar package that could have changed Zimbabwe back then. But when the negotiations turned murky, when demands surfaced behind closed doors, he made a decision few expected: he left. Publicly, the explanation was bureaucratic delays, but people in the room tell a different story, one that involved pressure, interference, and unacceptable demands. For Zimbabwe, his departure was a blow. For Dangote, it confirmed something he already suspected: Africa had potential, but unlocking it required a different approach, one not controlled by foreign companies, foreign engineering firms, or foreign pricing. Years later, when Dangote built his massive refinery in Lagos, he confronted something similar. Western and Chinese contractors quoted astronomical prices, tens of billions of dollars. And on top of that, they wanted ownership stakes, stakes that would have given them long-term control over an African refinery on African soil. Dangote refused. He gathered African engineers, African contractors, African expertise, and they built it, at a fraction of the cost. That refinery became proof not just of industrial capacity, but of independence. Because once Dangote proved that African megaprojects could be built at African prices, he no longer had to accept the old rules. He no longer needed foreign contractors to dictate terms. He could build what others thought impossible. And more importantly, he could choose where to build it. That realization is exactly what brought him back to Zimbabwe. To understand why Dangote's return is such a seismic shift, we need to revisit the turning point of his entire business philosophy, the Lagos refinery. When he first set out to build it, he approached Western and Chinese contractors, the same giants who have constructed energy infrastructure across the world for decades. Their offers came with dazzling presentations, glossy brochures, and decades of global experience. But the price, tens of billions of dollars. Numbers so high that even Africa's richest man stepped back. And beyond the price, there was something more unsettling: they wanted ownership. They didn't just want to build the refinery, they wanted a share of it, a foothold, a seat at the table in one of Africa's most strategic assets. For Dangote, that was unacceptable. So he did what almost no one expected. He said, "Fine, we'll build it ourselves." And that sentence, simple, almost quiet, triggered one of the most important industrial shifts in modern African history. African engineers, African construction companies, African steel, African hands. They built a world-class refinery at a fraction of the cost foreign companies demanded. That success changed how Dangote read the continent. It changed how he calculated risk. And above all, it changed how he saw opportunity. And that brings us to the moment everything became clear. When Dangote started scanning southern Africa, he didn't see landlocked nations as burdens. He saw them as markets that were paying too much for imported fuel, markets suffering because they had no way to receive energy directly. Markets hungry for alternatives. Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Malawi. countries spending fortunes importing fuel from Asia and Europe relying on long, fragile supply chains and unpredictable border routes. While most investors avoided these nations precisely because of their geography, Dangote looked at the map and saw leverage. Zimbabwe wasn't a dead end. It was the center of southern Africa. And so, after a decade of staying away, he returned. Not hastily, not emotionally, but with a plan forged from the lessons of Lagos. On that day, President Mnangagwa and Aliko Dangote sat down and signed a $1 billion agreement. No flashy ceremony, no red carpets, but the details were stunning. At the heart of the deal, a 2,000-kilometer pipeline that will run from Walvis Bay, Namibia, through Botswana and into Zimbabwe's second-largest city, Bulawayo. Attached to it, a 1.6 million barrel fuel storage facility, a cement factory, a fertilizer plant, power generation projects, all built not by Western companies, not by Chinese state contractors, but using the same cost-efficient African model that made the Lagos refinery possible. And then came the twist that few analysts had seen coming. This pipeline wouldn't only serve Zimbabwe. Botswana would earn transit fees. Zambia sits right next door. Malawi may be added. A network of 7 to 8 countries could soon be linked to Dangote's distribution system. Once these pipelines are operational, the countries they serve are essentially locked in. Landlocked nations don't have alternatives. If Dangote pumps fuel, they receive fuel. If he raises prices, their options stay limited. If he expands, their dependence deepens. This is where opportunity meets power. And that, precisely, is why the region and the world reacted. Western oil companies took immediate notice. They had long assumed that if Southern Africa ever modernized its energy infrastructure, it would be through them. This new model, a local billionaire building cross-border mega-projects with African labor and African supply chains, disrupts everything. Chinese companies, too, observed quietly. They have spent decades building infrastructure across Africa. But the Dangote model threatens a status quo they relied on high-cost contracting and long-term leverage. The truth is simple. A powerful African industrialist creating African infrastructure at African prices makes global players uncomfortable. And then, just as the region absorbed the news, Zimbabwe's political landscape added another layer of intrigue. Both Vice Presidents Chiwenga and Mohadi were absent from the signing ceremony. In most countries, that would be a small detail. In Zimbabwe, it's a political signal. Analysts whispered about internal rifts, questions over who negotiated what, who benefits, and who feels sidelined. Because billion-dollar deals always reshape power both outside and inside. And this one was no exception. To understand how deeply this deal could reshape Zimbabwe, you have to imagine what everyday life looks like when the power comes back on. Not the flicker of a generator, not a few hours of electric mercy, but stable, continuous energy, something most Americans have taken for granted their entire lives. The moment fuel prices drop in Zimbabwe, the ripple effect begins immediately. Factories that once staggered through half shifts suddenly regain full capacity. Workers who used to be sent home in the middle of the day can now count on a full paycheck. Machines run long enough to meet export quotas. Small businesses, barber shops, welding shops, bakeries finally operate without the constant fear that everything will shut down without warning. For years, mining companies, Zimbabwe's economic backbone, were burning unimaginable amounts of diesel just to power operations. Gold prices have been soaring, but Zimbabwe couldn't fully capitalize on the boom because the country simply didn't have the electricity to keep its mines operating at full throttle. With a steady fuel supply, that barrier begins to evaporate. Productivity rises, revenue increases, stability follows. And all of this is happening because one man decided to build a pipeline in a country most investors wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. The pipeline alone will employ thousands across Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. And when you add the cement factory, the fertilizer plant, and the power generation facilities, that number climbs into the tens of thousands. Jobs don't stay on paper. They become food on tables, school fees, paid medical bills covered. They become something quiet but powerful dignity. And then there's the refinery expansion back in Nigeria, 65,000 jobs created there. Combine these numbers across southern Africa, and you are looking at more than 100,000 positions tied directly or indirectly to this new phase of Dangote's regional strategy. For countries struggling with unemployment rates that would shock most Americans, this matters. While the social and economic benefits are clear, the political landscape inside Zimbabwe tells a more delicate story. When a billion-dollar deal arrives in any country, especially one with a history as complicated as Zimbabwe's, it shifts alliances. It threatens some, empowers others, and exposes deep fissures that often remain hidden until big money comes into the room. And that's exactly what happened. When both Vice Presidents Chiwenga and Mohadi missed the signing ceremony, it wasn't treated as an oversight. In Zimbabwean politics, absences speak louder than speeches. They raise questions: were they excluded intentionally? Did they disagree with the terms? Did they feel the deal benefited the wrong factions inside the ruling party? Or is a deeper struggle unfolding quietly behind closed doors? Different analysts offer different theories. Some believe factions inside ZANU-PF are wrestling over who gains influence in the emerging energy sector. Others say certain elites fear losing control if Dangote becomes the central player in the country's fuel supply. Regardless of which version is true, one thing is clear. This pipeline is not only an economic project, it is a political earthquake. On paper, Zimbabwe gains tremendously cheap fuel, industrial revival, transit, income, job creation, and a foundation strong enough to attract new investors who previously saw the country as too risky. But a deeper question hangs over all of it. Is Zimbabwe trading one form of dependency for another for decades? Western and Chinese companies held leverage because they controlled infrastructure and supply chains. Now, some analysts warn that Dangote could become a new center of gravity, an African one, yes, but still a single point of control. Landlocked nations have few alternatives once a pipeline becomes operational. If Dangote raises prices, they adapt. If he expands influence, they follow. If political disagreements arise, options remain limited. This is the paradox of development. A nation can rise and still risk binding itself to the very partner who helped lift it. Zimbabwe now stands at that crossroads. The next few years will reveal whether this deal becomes the foundation for true industrialization, or merely a different version of dependence, one more familiar and closer to home. From Washington to Brussels to Beijing, the deal signed quietly in Harare raised more questions than answers. Not because Zimbabwe is suddenly becoming a global superpower, but because what happened represents a shift in who gets to shape Africa's future. For decades, the United States, the European Union, and China have played dominant roles in building the continent's major infrastructure. Railways, ports, power plants, pipelines. They were almost always funded or engineered by foreign giants. And with every piece of infrastructure came influence. Political influence, strategic leverage, economic dependency. That was the old pattern. But something different is happening now. A powerful African industrialist is building infrastructure for African markets, and doing so at prices foreign contractors cannot compete with. That alone forces every major power to pay attention. For the United States, the situation is more complex than dollars and pipelines. It is about influence. America has long relied on its ability to shape policy and economic decisions in African nations through development aid investment programs and partnerships. But when African countries begin to develop regional energy networks without needing major Western financing, the balance starts to shift. A 2,000-kilometer pipeline that stretches across 3 nations and potentially serves up to 8 creates something Americans may not immediately recognize: a new regional center of gravity. A private African energy network not tied to Washington, not tied to Beijing, not tied to Brussels. For U.S. policymakers, this raises critical questions. If African nations gain cheaper, more reliable fuel domestically, will they still rely on Western financing? If Dangote expands this model across other landlocked nations, will American oil companies lose long-term markets? And perhaps, most importantly, what happens when Africa no longer needs external powers to build the infrastructure that defines its economic future? China, which spent 2 decades pouring billions into African infrastructure, sees the Zimbabwe pipeline as a direct challenge to its model. The Belt and Road strategy relies on long-term contracts that generate political goodwill and economic dependence. But a self-funded, locally engineered pipeline undermines the logic of Chinese contracting. It shows Africa can build without Beijing. Europe views it differently. Facing its own energy crises and supply challenges, the EU has watched African countries develop closer ties with competitors like China and Russia. A strong regional African energy hub, one not dependent on European firms, complicates Europe's strategy for maintaining relevance on the continent. This pipeline is not just steel, oil, and concrete. It is a statement. It signals that Africa is beginning to rethink who builds its future and who benefits from it. And that shift, even if quiet, even if ignored by headlines, is one of the most important geopolitical developments in years. Zimbabwe may simply want fuel and stability, but the world sees something bigger, forming something that will shape the next decade of global politics. As we step back and look at this entire story, Zimbabwe's long blackout years, Dangote's unexpected return, the 2,000-kilometer pipeline stretching across nations, it becomes clear that this is more than economics. It is more than energy. It is the quiet rewriting of how Africa defines power, vulnerability, and self-reliance. For Zimbabwe, this moment could become the beginning of a true industrial awakening. Cheaper fuel could breathe life back into factories that have been silent for years. Jobs could flow into communities long forgotten by policymakers, and a landlocked nation could finally stop paying the price of geography. But as history has taught us, especially for those of us old enough to have watched nations rise and fall over decades, every opportunity carries a shadow. A pipeline can lift a nation, or it can bind it. A powerful partner can become a bridge to development, or the beginning of a new dependency. And the future depends not on what is built, but on what is done with it. And this question, this tension between hope and caution, is not unique to Zimbabwe. Across the continent, leaders are being confronted with choices that will define their place in the world. In Burkina Faso, for example, many people are asking whether President Ibrahim Traoré can truly drive long-term reform, or whether he too will face the weight of external pressures and internal divisions. These stories, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, West Africa, are all threads in a larger fabric that is shaping the next chapter of Africa news. So the real question for Zimbabwe now is simple but profound. Will cheaper fuel lead to real industrialization? Will the nation finally add value to its lithium and platinum before exporting them? Or will Zimbabwe simply exchange its old dependencies for a new one, this time not on the West or China, but on a rising African power? And for those of you watching from the United States, especially those who have seen decades of geopolitical cycles, you know, better than most, that moments like this never stay small. They ripple outward. They shape markets, alliances, and futures in ways no headline ever fully captures. Zimbabwe's story is only beginning. What happens next will depend not on the pipeline itself, but on the choices made in the months and years that follow. If you believe Africa deserves the chance to build without foreign chains, please share this video. If you value truth more than headlines, hit subscribe, because we will continue following these stories long after the headlines move on. And now I'd like to hear from you. Which African country should we investigate next? Where do you see hidden opportunities the world is ignoring? Your insight matters. Your voice shapes this community. I'm here listening.